Happy New Year, everybody, and welcome to Automox Patch Tuesday Breakdown for January and the first Patch Tuesday webinar for 2022. We are thrilled that you can join us today for this popular monthly feature, and as always, we have a session just packed with information for you. My name is Eric Feldman, and I'm a Senior Product Marketing Manager here at Automox, and I'll be covering the critical Patch Tuesday updates. Joining us in the show this month is Senior Solutions Engineer Adam Whitman. Adam, please say hello and introduce yourself and tell us your role here at Automox.
Yeah, thanks, Eric, and hello, everyone. My name is Adam Whitman, and I'm one of the solutions engineers at Automox, and happy to be here today to discuss all the new findings when it comes to Patch Tuesday.
Thank you, Adam. And Adam is going to be covering a vital topic that everyone is interested in. That is the Log4j and the Log4 shell vulnerability. So first, a little bit of housekeeping items before we get into everything. We use the On24 platform for our webinars, and there's a few quick tips that we want to just share with you if you haven't joined us in the past. There's a slide view window, which is your primary viewing screen. That's where we'll be walking through the Patch Tuesday updates of the presentation, and you can customize the size of this as you see fit. Now, everyone's muted, of course, so we can give a really crisp schedule with everything here. Now, there's a QA box, and you can see the little screen there. It's on the lower right, and that's where, if you have questions, that's where you'll submit them. And anything that comes to mind, please just enter it in the box, and we'll do our best to answer it. Now, if we show any live demo, Adam may have something to show you. If we do, we're going to have that in a separate screen on the upper right, and you can also manually, control the size of that screen as you see fit. Now, what's on the agenda for today? Well, our Patch Tuesday webinar series, we organize and prioritize the high-impact issues offering the most vital information that impacts your environment regarding vulnerabilities and remediation. We're going to begin with an overview of Microsoft's patches for this month, for January. And while our focus is on critical vulnerabilities related to Microsoft, we'll also cover critical vulnerability from Google and some updates from Adobe as well. Then we're going to get into detail with the Microsoft critical and disclosed vulnerabilities. Now, after we cover the January Patch Tuesday content, Adam will cover in detail the timeline of the Apache Log4j vulnerability and remediation steps for Log4 shell. And when we're done with that part of the show or the webinar, we'll have a Q&A session, and Adam will be on hand to answer any questions. Now, I mentioned the question box there. If you have an idea for a question, you want to put it in, don't wait till the end. Just go ahead and throw it in as it comes to your mind, and we'll queue those up when we have the time towards the end of the presentation. Now, here's an important thing. Be sure you stay tuned to the end, because we're going to be giving away not one, but 2 prizes this month. So let's get into it. Well, it's been said that the new year brings a fresh beginning. People make resolutions and companies close another year in the books and begin a new one. Students prepare for the spring school year. 2022 is also going to give us a new year of software vulnerabilities to monitor, report, and remediate. Now, Microsoft is starting this year off with a bang, 97 vulnerabilities this month, and that is more than all but 2 months last year in 2021. So it's really the 3rd highest total in the last 12, 13 months. This month's total is also 30% higher than the monthly average for last year. So, as I said, we're starting the year off with a bang. The number of reported critical vulnerabilities is also causing IT ops and SecOps teams to start the year off with extra work. We have 9 critical vulnerabilities this month. Now, that's slightly higher than last year's monthly average of 8.4, but it also represents the highest monthly total of critical vulnerabilities since July of last year. Fortunately, we don't have any exploited vulnerabilities to report this month. Microsoft's critical vulnerabilities include operating systems and important applications and components, including Microsoft Windows, Windows Server, Exchange Server, Active Directory, and Microsoft Office. So be sure to prioritize any remediation for these particular applications and components. We have a relatively light month from Adobe with 5 security updates impacting a number of their applications. And this is in contrast to last month, when Adobe issued 11 updates. But most of the Adobe updates are at the lowest level of priority, and that Adobe advises that those level 3 vulnerabilities, administrators can update, quote, at their discretion. So good news from, I suppose, from Adobe. Google has released 37 vulnerabilities for the Chrome browser, or they've issued an update to remediate 37 vulnerabilities in the browser. Unfortunately, only one was rated critical, and we'll get to that, and we'll tell you the remediation steps for it. Now, final note on this. Remember that Automox recommends that all critical and exploited vulnerabilities are patched within a 72-hour window, in particular, those highlighted this month. So let's take a look at the vulnerabilities in detail. Let's start off with Adobe. As I mentioned, we have 5 security updates for Windows and Mac OS-based applications. 4 of the 5 security updates are assigned to priority 3, as I mentioned, they're lowest. But they resolve issues in Adobe Illustrator, Bridge, InCopy, and InDesign. Now, all these products have historically, they've not been targeted by attackers. So these priority 3 updates, be sure to get to that at your discretion. The security update that's should pay attention to this month is ABS B22-01 for Adobe Acrobat and Reader. Now, Adobe has given this a priority rating of 2, which is not obviously severe as number 1. However, because of the ubiquity of Acrobat and Reader, how widely adopted they are in corporate environments, Automox recommends that you prioritize patching this particular one, ABS B22-01. Next up is Google. Now, Google released, as I said before, an update to Chrome for Windows, Mac, the Mac OS, and Linux to remediate 37 vulnerabilities, and one of which is rated critical, CVE 2022-0096. That's a critical use after free vulnerability, impacting some unknown processing of the storage component. They haven't disclosed exactly what it does. But the manipulation with an unknown input leads to a memory corruption vulnerability. The exploitability is said to be easy, and it's possible to initiate the attack remotely. No form of authentication is needed for this exploitation, as it demands that the victim is doing some kind of user interaction. So the technical details are not publicly available, nor is an exploit, but Automox recommends upgrading to Chrome version 97.0.4692.71 that remediates these vulnerabilities. However, there's an important note. The news site, the Google news site, 9to5 Google, wrote that there have been some users on specific versions of iOS, for an iPhone, who've reported that Chrome is freezing after applying this update. Apparently, clearing out the browser cache will kind of fix that freezing, but be forewarned about that. There is some reports about that. We have yet to hear anything from Google about that, other than the news report from 9to5 Google. Okay, let's get into the Microsoft updates in detail. First up, CVE 2021-22947 is a critical and publicly disclosed remote code execution vulnerability impacting the open source curl library used by Microsoft Windows. And curl is spelled just as you see it, lowercase c and then URL. Curl is a library and command line tool for transferring data using various network protocols. An attacker could carry out a man-in-the-middle attack by exploiting how curl handles cached or pipeline responses from IMAP or POP3, SMTP, or FTP servers. The attacker could inject the fake responses, then pass through the TLS traffic from the legitimate server and trick curl into sending the attacker's data back to the user as valid and authenticated. Automox recommends rolling out this update quickly because of the public disclosure. This disclosure significantly increases the chance of threat actors exploiting this flaw. Next up, CVE 2022-21883. This one is a critical elevation of privileges vulnerability in which IDE drives, remember IDE drives as paired to SATA or SCSI or what have you, those IDE drives within a Windows virtual machine server may be vulnerable to an attack. Now, due to their maximum I/O size, the IDE drives in a VM are often deployed just for operating systems, and therefore you may have a limited set of devices with this potential vulnerability. With a local attack vector and a high attack complexity, a threat actor would need to gain access to an underprivileged account, such as through an unsecure user password or an account with minimal access controls, what have you, to expose this vulnerability. Certain versions of Microsoft Windows 7, 8, 10, and 11, and Windows Server 2008, 12, 16, 19, and 22 are affected. Of course, Automox recommends patching those virtual machines with IDE drives promptly. Obviously, if you have a virtual machine with a SATA drive, SATA, you're not exposed to this vulnerability. Next up, CVE 2022-21840 is a critical remote code execution vulnerability impacting Microsoft Office, including both 32-bit and 64-bit versions. Exploitation isn't highly likely, and it's yet to be seen or proven in the wild, as this CVE has not been publicly disclosed. But it's a low complexity and no privileges remote code execution vulnerability, and that could allow an attacker to execute their own and possibly malicious code in the system, as it requires no elevated privileges of any kind. Of course, elevated privileges is moving from a user to administrator, etc. Releases as old as 2013 are reported in the CVE details, which included Microsoft Office web apps, Office for Mac, and various SharePoint products, and more. Seeing nearly 10-year-old software in a current CVE is no surprise, as attackers rely upon legacy systems that are likely unpatched and therefore extremely vulnerable. They know all too well, those hackers know all too well, how daunting it can be to keep everything updated. But automation can help, and certainly Automox can help you with that. As this is a critical vulnerability, it's recommended to update as soon as possible to minimize any risk of exposure. Moving on is another critical vulnerability, this one CVE 2022-21857. This impacts Microsoft Active Directory domain services. Now, for those who don't know, Active Directory domain services provides methods for storing information about objects on a network and making this data available to network users and administrators. Active Directory also integrates security with login authentication and access control to those objects, such as a server on the network, etc. By exploiting an elevation of privilege vulnerability, an attacker can elevate privileges, as I mentioned, changing an account, a user account, to administrative access across the trust boundary under certain conditions. Due to the crucial role Microsoft Active Directory has in enterprise networks and security, Automox recommends that this patch be applied immediately. Next up is a pair of two critical remote code execution vulnerabilities in the Windows DirectX graphics kernel that were disclosed this month. DirectX, the graphics kernel, is a subsystem that enables internal components like graphic cards and drives or external devices like printers and input devices. The vulnerabilities, CVE 2022-21898 and 21912, both score a CVSS score of 7.8 and are prevalent in Windows 10, Windows Server 2019, and newer operating systems. Attackers can use these remote code execution vulnerabilities to deploy and execute code on a target system. This can allow attackers to easily take full control of the system, as well as create a base of operations within the network to spread to other systems. Well, that's how hackers work and how attacks work, right? This is a critical pair of vulnerabilities to address as soon as possible to minimize risk, especially given the fact that nearly every corporate Windows device will have this vulnerability present. Common and widespread vulnerabilities like these are critical for attackers trying to steal corporate data or infiltrating separate sensitive systems. So it's important for organizations to patch and remediate within the 72-hour window per our recommendation to minimize exposure. CVE 2022-21907. This one is a remote code execution vulnerability that impacts some versions of Windows 10, 32, and 64-bit, Windows 11, and Windows Server 2019 and 22. The HTTP protocol stack, this is what enables Windows and applications to communicate with other devices. If exploited, this vulnerability could enable an authenticated attacker to send a specially crafted packet to a targeted server utilizing the HTTP protocol stack. And that's a file, for those who don't know, in Windows, that's a file known as http.sys. Now, if they could do that, they can process packets and ultimately execute arbitrary code and take control of the affected system. Now, there's no workaround for this one, so Automox recommends prioritizing the patching of affected servers. Moving on is our last two critical vulnerabilities. The first one you should pay attention to because it impacts Microsoft Exchange Server, CVE 2022-28146. It impacts Exchange Server versions 2013, 16, and 19. Now, this is one of 3 Microsoft Exchange Server vulnerabilities this month, but it's the only one listed as critical. The others are important, so we're not going to cover the other ones. But the attack vector for this particular vulnerability is listed as, quote, adjacent. That means it's limited at the protocol level to a logically adjacent topology. So, for example, it can't be exploited across the internet, but needs something tied to the target. So if you're on a physical network, a shared physical network, such as a Wi-Fi or a logical network being in the same local subnet, or from, let's say, within a secure or limited administrative domain, such as a secure VPN. This is common to many attacks that require man-in-the-middle type setups, or that rely upon initially gaining a foothold in another environment. Automox recommends prioritizing the installation of this update, and if my memory is correct, I believe it scored a CVSS score of 9. So this one's important. Make sure you take care of it. And finally, our last critical vulnerability is CVE 2022-21917, a critical vulnerability identified in the HEVC video extensions. HEVC is an abbreviation for High Efficiency Video Coding, and it's an advanced video compression standard used for video storage and playback on Windows 10 systems. This vulnerability can lead to remote code execution, which can be highly impactful and dangerous, given that it can provide attackers the opportunity to directly run malicious code on the exploited systems. Successful exploitation would require an attacker to bait an authenticated user into opening a maliciously crafted media file, which would result in remote code execution on that victim's machine. Microsoft does not provide mitigation recommendations aside from patching. However, most affected customers will automatically be updated via the Microsoft Store, and guidance is provided to check the package version to ensure it is the current update. Okay, so now we're going to highlight several vulnerabilities that have been publicly disclosed. First up, CVE 2021-36976 is a high and publicly disclosed remote code execution vulnerability impacting Windows libarchive. What is libarchive? Well, it's an open source library used to create and read streaming archive formats. Windows system utilize this library in different versions of Windows 10 systems, as well as Windows 11 and Windows Server 2019 and 22. This specific vulnerability is of medium severity with a CVSS score of 6.5 out of 10. However, it is publicly disclosed, though not yet exploited in the wild, as far as we know. A threat actor can exploit this vulnerability to remotely execute code in memory on vulnerable systems. We recommend applying this patch to affected systems due to the prevalence of Windows 10 and 11 usage on corporate devices. CVE 2022-21836 is a high and publicly disclosed spoofing vulnerability impacting Windows certificate services. This vulnerability impacts certain versions of Windows 7, 8, 10, 11, and Windows Server 2008, 2012, 16, 19, and 22. So many versions of Windows are impacted by this. Now, what is Windows Certificate Services? It's a service running on Windows, on a Windows Server or Windows operating system that receives requests for new digital certificates, a common credential that provides a means to verify identity. A successful attacker could bypass what's known as the WBT binary, the Windows Platform Binary Table. It can bypass that verification by using a small number of compromised certificates. Now, even though this vulnerability has not been exploited, due to its nature, Automox recommends the prioritizing of this particular patch. And our last two publicly disclosed vulnerabilities are, first up, CVE 2022-21874 is a high and publicly disclosed Windows Security Center API remote code execution vulnerability impacting Windows Defender. Now, we've seen several Windows Defender exploits over the past few months. Now, an attacker can trigger this vulnerability and execute remote code by making an authenticated HTTP request. If Microsoft Defender is disabled, devices are not exploitable and no action is required. So if you're not using it, there's nothing really to worry about. But keep in mind that the binaries, they're still on the disk, even when disabled. So a vulnerability scanner may still show this issue. And, a false positive because it can't be exploited. Vulnerabilities in Microsoft Defender are always important to patch quickly, especially when they have been publicly disclosed like this one. To remediate this vulnerability, organizations should verify that the latest version of the Microsoft Malware Protection Engine and definition updates are being actively downloaded and installed for the Microsoft anti-malware products. And last up, CVE 2022-21919. This is a high and publicly disclosed Windows User Profile Service elevation of privilege vulnerability. This particular vulnerability could give a local, in other words, a non-network vector to an attacker who could then elevate their user privileges. We've seen this one a few times this particular month. This is a high complexity vulnerability that requires no user interaction, but at this point it's still just a POC and it's yet to be exploited in the wild. The user profile service affected is part of Windows and Windows Server, and this goes back as far back as Windows 7, Microsoft Windows, and 2008 for Windows Server, respectively. If an attacker were able to elevate the privileges on a user profile, this could obviously give them all kinds of unwanted access to a Windows computer. Now imagine that happening on the Windows Server that hosts your Active Directory and SharePoint domain. That's a definite nightmare scenario for any administrator or user, but it's easily preventable. Because this vulnerability has been given a rating of high, it's recommended that Windows and Windows Server administrators and users update with the official Microsoft fix as soon as possible. Okay, and that covers all the vulnerabilities for this month. And now it's time to turn the controls over to Adam. Adam, it's all yours.
Yeah, thanks, Eric. And hello, everyone. Again, my name is Adam Whitman, and I'm one of the solutions engineers at Automox. And today, I'm going to talk everything Apache Log4j. Now, we all know this has been around since late November of 2021, but I think it's important to revisit and discuss the Log4j vulnerability, as it did have a CVSS score of 10 out of 10. And some of you may still be trying to understand your exposure and remediate Log4Shell. So I'm going to go through an overview of the Log4Shell vulnerability and outline some ways to help you understand your exposure and then ultimately remediate it. Okay, so first we'll start with what is Apache Log4j. And it is an open source Java-based logging utility, and it's part of the Apache logging services. And this is a project that's maintained by the Apache Software Foundation. Log4j is one of several Java logging frameworks. Many companies use Log4j libraries worldwide to enable logging and configure a wide set of applications. So it's used pretty much in most applications out there. And Log4j records events, errors, and routine system operations and communicates diagnostic messages about them to system administrators and users. And a common example of Log4j in work is if you type and click in a bad web link and you get a 404 message, the web server running the domain of the web link you tried to get to tells you that there is no web page available. And it also records the event in a log for server administrators using Log4j. It's one of those backend components that users of software rarely see, yet is present in almost every application, not just Log4j. People use other types of logging utilities as well, but Log4j is one of the more popular ones. So let's talk about what Log4Shell is and how that's actually working. So Log4Shell, and it's identified as CVE 2021-44228, is a zero-day vulnerability in Log4j, and it's involving arbitrary code execution. It's pretty dangerous. The vulnerability has existed unnoticed since 2013 and was privately disclosed to the Apache Software Foundation, of which Log4j is a project, and was publicly disclosed on December 9th of 2021. Now, Apache gave Log4Shell a CVSS severity rating of 10, and that's the highest score available. The exploit is simple to execute, and it's estimated to affect hundreds of millions of devices. So the easeability of actually exploiting that and the number of devices that are affected all factor into that CVSS score of 10. And again, the Common Vulnerability Scoring System is an open industry standard for assessing the severity of computer system security vulnerabilities and is used by most organizations worldwide. And it's, CVSS provides a way to capture the principal characteristics of the vulnerability. So again, how many people are infected and how easy it is to exploit are factors of that. And then they produce a numerical score reflecting its severity. And the purpose is to help organizations properly assess and prioritize their vulnerability management process. So having a score of 10 out of 10 is a very big deal and should be rectified as soon as possible. So how does Log4Shell actually work, and how is it affecting Log4j? So the vulnerability, it takes advantage of Log4j sessions, allowing requests to arbitrary LDAP and JNDI servers and not checking the responses. And this is allowing attackers to execute arbitrary Java code on the system or leak sensitive information about the device. A list of its affected software projects have been published by the Apache security team. So you can go to the Apache website and see all the affected softwares by this exploit. Also, this exploit affects commercial services, including AWS, Cloudflare, Minecraft, Microsoft, iCloud, Cisco, Google Cloud, and many others. And many software and cloud providers have been rushing to address the issue and advise customers on how to best proceed. According to analysts, the vulnerability affects 93% of enterprise cloud environments. That's a large number of infected environments, especially in the more of the commercial space. And also Checkpoint, which is a cybersecurity company, said that more than 40% of corporate networks worldwide were coming under attack in one form or another by Log4Shell. So I quickly want to outline a timeline of what's been discovered since Log4Shell was first introduced and what the current recommendations are by Apache to actually remediate this vulnerability. So November 24th, security researchers discover the now infamous Log4Shell vulnerability that allows unauthenticated attackers to execute remote code on vulnerable systems. And this is scoring a CVSS of 10 out of 10 because of how easy it is to exploit and remote execute this code. Now on December 6th, Apache Log4j releases version 2.15.0 to remediate the vulnerability. Shortly after, CVE 2021-45046 was discovered. And that was a flaw that eventually netted a CVSS score of 9 out of 10. And after further research led to the discovery that this vulnerability allowed full remote code execution by an attacker. So now we got a new exploit that was discovered after Apache released 2.15.0 to remediate the original Log4Shell vulnerability. On December 13th, version 2.16.0 of Apache Log4j is released to fix CVE 2021-45046. After that, yet another vulnerability is discovered, This is CVE 2021-45105, and that scored a CVSS of 5.9 out of 10. And it introduced a denial of service vulnerability due to the infinite recursion in lookup evaluations. So on December 18th, the Log4j team released version 2.17.0 to fix the denial of service vulnerability. And then on December 28th, yet another patch was released, and this is version 2.17.1, and this is our current version. And this time to remediate CVE 2021-44832, which scored a 6.6 out of 10 in CVSS scoring, and that allowed for code executions by attackers with permissions to modify the login configuration file. And that's where we're at today. 2.17.1 is the most recent version and what is recommended by Apache. Okay, so let's talk about some ways to actually identify and actually remediate Log4j in your environment. So really the easiest way to remediate this vulnerability is, of course, to upgrade your Apache Log4j to 2.17.1. So that is what we recommend you doing to fully rectify all these different vulnerabilities that exist. Now, no matter what your course of action is, you'll need to identify where Log4j is in your environment. What makes this vulnerability so difficult to remediate is that not just applications using the library are vulnerable, the services using those affected applications are also vulnerable. So to help identify where Log4j exists, we suggest using either the Arctic Wolf Log4j Deep Sand scripts or the Cybersecurity and Infrastructure Security Agency, better known as the CISA's Log4j scanner. Now, if you do use the Arctic Wolf Deep Scan, they provide a PowerShell and Bash script within the GitHub that you can upload into an Automox worklet and execute remotely to devices. And this will identify any devices that are currently infected by the Log4j exploit and post a response in the activity log. Now, just really quickly, I do want to show you what that looks like with an Automox so you can identify and actually remediate that through your existing tools. So just real quick, I do want to show you what this looks like. So these are different worklets that have ran across some different Windows devices in my environment. And we're just using that Arctic Wolf Deep Scan and using the PowerShell syntax they provided in their GitHub. And as you can see, we're posting the results in our activity log under the details section about any devices that are not affected and pass or have passed the actual scan are currently good to go. So we're going to identify any devices that are infected by Log4j or those devices that are currently not infected. Okay, so going back to this, we will also, once you are ready to patch, you can download the latest version of the Apache logging website, and we'll also provide a link for you in this web description. The most severe vulnerabilities are CVE 2021-44228, which is the Log4 shell that scored that 10 out of 10 and provides that remote code execution to attackers. The other vulnerabilities discovered in version 2.15.0, the version intended to fix Log4 shell, and that's CVE 2021-45046, and is another remote code execution, and that also scored a 9 out of 10 CVSS score. You actually have to have a non-default configuration in your pattern layout to be affected by that remote code execution vulnerability. So if you're using a default configuration for your pattern layout, you don't have to worry about that one. But if you did change that configuration, you need to make sure to upgrade to protect yourself against that vulnerability. Okay, so lastly, where can I download these packages? Well, 2.17 is the most updated version of Log4j, and it fixes the additional vulnerabilities as well. So the denial of service that scored a 5.9 out of 10, and also the arbitrary code execution vulnerability that scored a 6.6 out of 10. On top of those two remote code execution exploits discussed previously, and you may have missed this in the chaos of this initial vulnerabilities, but just note that 2.17.1 will fix those vulnerabilities as well as that Log4j, Log4 shell vulnerability. You can find these links to the Log4j downloads at the Apache Log4j security page, and we have that in the video description as well. And again, patching your systems is the most reliable way to remediate these vulnerabilities. So we hope this helps you understand what your options are and how to remediate this vulnerability, and also how we got here from the beginning of November 24 up to December 28th. All right, Eric, I'll pass it back over to you.
All right, thank you, Adam, and hopefully we've provided some good information on Log4j and Log4Shell. Something tells me that this vulnerability is not disappearing anytime soon, but hopefully you'll be protected and be able to remediate any versions out there. All right, it's time for some questions, and we do have some queued up, and we thank you for those. So if you have anything in mind, be sure to pop it in. We'll do our best to answer it if we can, and if not, we'll research that out and post it in the community for you. So first up, first question is from Igor. Igor wants to know that Windows Server, the January 2022 security updates are causing a DC boot loop. What's a good way to account for bugs introduced in Patch Tuesdays like this one using Automox for critical infrastructure? Adam, can you answer that one?
Yeah, absolutely, Eric, and great question, Igor. And I think this also ties into Andy's question as well, in terms of how these KBs could affect domain controllers, and not just your domain controllers, but workstations and other types of Windows devices. And Automox offers ways to do ring deployment for these different patches to make sure that you're testing them properly in your test environments before you start rolling them out to your production environments. So ensuring proper testing, validation, making sure it's not causing issues in your test environment is what we recommend doing in these types of situations. And then once you're confident with your testing that you can start rolling it out to your production environment, you can easily set policies targeting those different rings to deploy the patches out to your production domain controllers. So, sometimes they could cause issues. Obviously, sometimes it doesn't cause any issues, but it's always good to test those patches for a period of time just to give you a proper understanding of the effect across your environment. And also, if Microsoft or any other vendor does find issues in those patches, it gives Microsoft time to pull those. And if Microsoft pulls those patches, then we're not going to see them and not apply them to your production environment. You can also ensure that these different patches are blacklisted in your Automox environment. So even if you have a policy that's targeting them, if you globally blacklisted that software update across your infrastructure, then we're never going to apply it with the policies. So different steps and measures that you can do to both test and then also blacklist softwares for being applied in your production environments.
All right, thank you, Adam. And Igor, thanks for researching that out and asking a very detailed and insightful question. We really appreciate that. Absolutely terrific. Moving on, a question from Jay. This one I'm going to ask you again, Adam. I don't have the answer myself, but for the Microsoft remote code execution vulnerability, I presume this is for the one from Microsoft Office.
Yeah.
I imagine that this one either does not affect or is automatically patched with the Office 365 Office suite. Well, what can you tell us about this one?
Yeah, absolutely. And this is something I have to go back and actually take a look to see how it affects the Office suite. My first assumption is yes, it would affect the Office 365 Office suite. So the recommendation is if you see your device in Automox and you see an Office 365 update available, we'll have all that CVE data contained under there. And if it's available, our recommendation is to patch it using Automox or some other method. Now, Automox can handle Office 365 patches for you, so we can maintain those through our normal patching workflows. But my recommendation there would be to see if a device has it available and the CVE recorded under the patch, and if so, to go ahead and install it using Automox.
Okay, Jay, hopefully that answers your question. And next up, you may have already covered this, Adam, the question from Andy about domain controllers. Are there any issues with patching domain controllers with a specific KB? Andy says, I heard from the grapevine to investigate.
Yeah.
So,
Yeah, definitely. And I think it's always the best practice to make sure you're testing your patches before they get rolled out, so you don't run into that issue. So yeah, this goes back into the answer that I gave Igor, is that you need to test those patches, validate them through your ring deployments, and make sure that they're not causing issues on those dev devices before you start rolling them out to your prod infrastructure.
Okay. Well, we that was all the questions we have so far. So if there, we'll take questions up until we end. So we're going to move on. But if someone puts a question or two in, we will certainly go back in and cover them.
Yep, I'll be paying attention to the Q&A, Eric. So if I see anything, I'll either answer that one off, or I'll just answer it at the end of the presentation. Sound good?
Terrific. That works. All right. So let's move on. Just a quick FYI for everybody. Our social media accounts, be sure to follow us on Twitter and LinkedIn. You know, we produce a lot of content here at Automox. There's a whole team of people that produce a lot of content, thought leadership content, everywhere from blogs to videos, these webinar sessions, and more. And you could be first to know. We post it right away on social media. So if you follow us, you'll get alerts and you'll be able to know what we're working on and what's coming out, and new product announcements, just about everything. So be sure to follow us. I know I do, and I'm learning stuff from my own company as well. So hopefully you'll take us up on that. All right. Well, guess what? It's time for everyone's favorite moment, is when we give away some prizes. And today I mentioned we're giving away two. First is going to be an Amazon gift card, and the second is going to be some valuable Automox swag. And I guess it's going to be one of those surprise boxes, and we don't know what's in there, but you never know what could be. Anything from a t-shirt to a Yeti tumbler or what have you. So we're going to pop up a trivia question, and the first one to answer it correctly will be the winner of the Amazon gift card for $50, and the runner-up will receive the swag package. So get ready. Here we go. How many critical vulnerabilities were disclosed by Microsoft this month? So first up, to give us how many critical vulnerabilities were disclosed by Microsoft this month will win. Okay, we've got winners, folks. That one went really quick, and I had a feeling it would. All right, the answer is 9. Excellent. Andy, you are the winner, and Paul, you are the runner-up. So Paul, you're going to get a box of swag, and Andy, you're going to get a $50 Amazon gift card. So congratulations to the winners. We thank you, everybody, for participating. We love doing this. Love giving away prizes. So we have, I don't see any other questions coming up into the queue. So you know what? I think that's going to end it for this month. This is the end of the first Patch Tuesday webinar for 2022. And we're so happy you can join us and spend some time with us. We really appreciate your interest in everything Automox. Now, as I mentioned, for the latest in Automox updates, be sure to follow us on LinkedIn and Twitter. We thank you so much for joining us today for the start off this new year. And on behalf of everyone here at Automox, thank you so much for your support. We look forward to working with all of you in 2022. Have a great day, everyone, and thank you so much again for joining us.